Hello, everyone. Welcome to a second look. My name is Neil Earle, and hello, Duarte. This is the summer of 2005, and we are one town reading one book. And this summer, that book has been The Martian Chronicles by the great Ray Bradbury. And of course, many of us got out to see him here on March 19th. Tonight, we're going to look at this book, The Martian Chronicles, with the help of Dr. David Lewis, who is visiting us, joining us again from Citrus College. Good to have you with us, Dr. David Lewis.
Thank you. As always, I'm glad to be here.
And as I was saying, we did have Ray Bradbury here in our own hometown on March 19th, speaking to a packed crowd, I must say. It was hard to find a seat at the Performing Arts Center. And quite a turnout. He told us quite a bit about himself, how he put these stories together. Had you ever read much of Ray Bradbury before?
I read some. I read some. What I did read, at least, I'm familiar with, first and foremost, of course, the Martian Chronicles. And I read it when I was a kid. I read it in grade 9. It was 1963. And what was interesting about it, my first reaction to it was I found it rather, looking at it at the time, I found it rather depressing and spooky.
Yeah.
It was like a Twilight Zone, and of course Bradbury, I believe, is written for the Twilight Zone. But it was scary. I actually found it scary and kind of wasn't your typical. This was in the days before Star Trek,
Right.
and Star Wars, and it wasn't your typical science fiction before Star Trek. Star Wars a lot of it tended to be kind of grim, kind of what they would call prophetic in a kind of a negative way. Bradbury once said that he was trying to prevent a future rather than envision one.
Well, the year is 1950. I just wanted to let our audience know that. A lot of you, of course, have been reading the novel this summer. The year is 1950. Now, 1949, the Soviet Union exploded their atomic bomb, right?
And yeah, see, this is the beginning of the atomic age. We had the bomb in 45, and we used it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then Russia got the bomb a few years later. But you begin to see some of the stories in there. You have the civil rights movement. Keep in mind, this is 1950, and there's one story in there where African Americans go to Mars because they can't stand the discrimination. It's like Liberia. They can't stand this discrimination here. And in 1950, that discrimination was very, very real.
It was
Jim
intense,
Crow was
right.
still. It was intense. Jim Crow was still alive and kicking in the South.
4 years before Brown versus the Board of Education.
Yes.
4 years before the bus strike, bus boycott in Montgomery.
Here you see the fears of nuclear war. You see some things, though, that are kind of out of sync. Bradbury, in a way, is way ahead of his time. There's some things, sentiments that you won't see until the late 60s or the 70s, like environmentalism.
Right. We want to talk about that. It's interesting
environmentalism and the sense of American guilt. I mean, in 1950, there was a feeling Americans were very, very proud of their accomplishments.
They just won the war.
Just won the war, the Marshall Plan, the history books were written. And here you have a parable. See, the interesting thing about science fiction, Ray Bradbury knew it, Gene Roddenberry knew it with Star Trek, is you can say things in sci-fi that you can't say normally.
It sort of sets up a different universe, and you can reflect on, which is, of course, the whole purpose of literature. It's interesting you mention he does jump around a lot, because when he was here, he talked about how he wrote the Martian Chronicles. He had a couple of stories. He went to his editor at Doubleday in New York City. He was so poor, he was 25 years old. His wife was pregnant. He was from the Northeast. You're from upstate New York.
Yes, take it from me, writers don't make a lot of money.
That's right, because you've got more than a few books to your credit. And unless you're Peyton Place, you just don't do. Anyway, he showed up at Doubleday, and his editor said, "What have you got?" And he said, "I've got a couple of short stories." They were Martian things. He said, "Well, we don't really like short stories. Why don't you go see if you can write a few more, weave them together." And that's what he did. I think in just about 1 or 2 nights, he cranked out a bunch of stories, and they became the Martian Chronicles, a starving 25-year-old with a pregnant wife. That's why it was so fascinating to hear him tell those stories. So
Yes.
like you said, yeah, he's a compadre of yours coming from the Northeast. You mentioned I mean, some of the things that really got me, and of course this story is set in November 2005. And I
Yes.
think this is one reason the city chose the Martian Chronicles, because many of the stories, and talk about this very year, even though it's 1950 and they project ahead, and you have all of these, the Martians have sort of been wiped out by chicken pox, I think it was. The Earthlings
Yes.
bring chicken pox to Mars,
Well,
which
this is exactly what happened to Native Americans.
and it's also a straight borrowing from War of the Worlds, which is
Yes.
another movie that's going to be coming
Right.
out
See,
here in September.
interestingly, we've always been obsessed with them. One of the great frustrations we've had, we've always been obsessed with the Martians.
Right.
The Martians were the stuff of sci-fi. H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds. Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote The Martian. He had his Martian series.
And I have to interject and say, by the way, that Bradbury quite unabashedly admitted he was a Burroughs fan, and this is just, he says, a continuation of Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Werner von Braun in the 1950s envisioned a trip to Mars with these 6 big spaceships that were like flying cities that would go to
Well,
Mars.
remember Percival Lowell in the 20s, was it? Thought he had discovered canals on Mars. and
Yes.
Postulated.
And science fiction writers, more than any other place in the universe, Mars was the most popular. It was nearby. It might harbor life. There seemed to be evidence of life with canals.
About
and
the
things.
same size
Yes.
as the Earth.
And then it was a terrible disappointment for a lot of sci-fi buffs
Yeah,
and
when the
believers when Viking landed on Mars and brought back those pictures and showed no evidence of life.
and the interesting thing, when we had our
There were no Martians, and it was
Right.
very disappointing to a lot of people.
Right. When we had our discussion with the One Town, One Book about the book, there were several of us there. And the lady who was moderating it said, really, you mentioned science fiction, and I should say Ray Bradbury says, well, I'm a science fantasist, is what he likes to call himself. But still, it will still fit, because this lady mentioned that really the Martian Chronicles show that human nature is the same wherever you go, and you don't escape anything.
See, the Martian Chronicles are really about Earth, not about Mars. And
Exactly.
it's about America.
This is what, and like I said, I'm not really a science fiction or fantasist reader myself, but the more I read these stories, the more I get out of them from the point, and it's sort of eerie and spooky, because he has a section here where in November 2005, the Earthlings now who inhabit Mars are sitting on their porches looking at Earth being engulfed in an atomic war. As he says here, there was Earth, there was the coming war. They stood on the porches and tried to believe in the existence of Earth, much as they had once tried to believe in the existence of Mars, and to all intents and purposes, Earth was now dead. Space was an anesthetic. 70 million miles of space numbed you, put you to sleep, depopulated Earth, and allowed these people here to go on with their work. But here they talk about this atomic war, and this is 1950. This is,
Yes.
Bradbury's one of these sensitive intellectuals.
Yes, he's very afraid that we're going to blow ourselves up.
And like I said, 1949 was one thing for the United States to have the atomic bomb, the
When
nuclear
Stalin
monopoly.
got it,
When Stalin got it in 49, and of course one of the
Yes.
great events that really sent the United States into the heebie-jeebies, to use a technical phrase, in the late 40s was the fall of China to communism
Yes.
in 1948.
yes.
So this really, like you said, you had a sense of pride and optimism from winning the war, but there were these tremendous fears. And I
Yes.
think you were going to comment even more about that.
Yes, what you see in the Martian Chronicles, what you see with Bradbury is he has a lurking suspicion that all is not well, that there are dragons, there are problems ahead.
Things that go bump in the night. as they
Yes,
say.
yes. And you get, later on, you get the nuclear war, but the environmental thing.
Yes.
There's also
Right.
the
And
environmental concerns.
it's not even a phrase that we knew about at the time, right? And it sort of
Yes.
revolves around this third expedition, which is supposed to be April 2000, as
Yes.
he's projecting each of these stories ahead.
Yes.
And he talks about the third expedition. 17 men come from Earth, and this one guy named Spender sort of goes native. He realizes the Martians did have a great civilization. We wiped them out, and of course you'd mentioned
It's
the native.
Dances with Wolves. This is
Right.
Dances with Wolves. Only at a time, if you remember the early 50s, Native Americans did not have, neither did African Americans, but there was a lot of racial stereotyping.
They did not have a place at the table back in those days.
It was still a predominantly, multiculturalism was virtually unheard of in the early 1950s. Popeye cartoons stereotyped the Japanese. I remember watching cartoons where the Chinese were stereotyped and demonized. Arabs are still stereotyped and demonized on
yes,
TV.
One of our human concerns. This is actually
Jews weren't because of the Holocaust. People were a little bit reluctant about that, but Indians, Native Americans were terribly. All you had to do, you remember you had Amos and Andy. But you also had the Lone Ranger.
Right.
And the Lone Ranger, you had Tonto, and Indians were always nasty and mean, and they were always the enemy, and they were bad, and they were they always spoke in grunts and groans.
There is definitely, I misspoke myself. I said it was April 2000. It was actually June 2001. He set this episode, Jeff Spender and Captain Black, I think it is, and 15 other men. They come on the expedition. This episode's called The Moon Be Still As Bright. Actually, this is one of the ones he had written in 1948, one of the ones he'd written earlier. And I'll just read a little bit of this because people might wonder what you're referring to when you talk about an environmental, a minorities concern.
Yes. There's also a subtle fascination with Eastern religions and holistic views of. In the 1950s, there wasn't very much in the way of holistic thinking and sort of New Age thinking.
And we'll get into a little bit of this.
And what you see, some
with
of the things,
Star Wars,
Bradbury, yes, but Bradbury's Martians, they're sort of a mixture of Native Americans, and they have the same holistic philosophy of living in harmony with nature that you find a lot of Taoism and Native American traditions.
And into dreams and telepathy. It says
yes.
The Martians had the fair brownish skin, the yellow coin eyes, the soft musical voices. But like you were saying, Spender in this episode called The Moon Be Still As Bright, June 2001, he set this. Spender and the captain are talking, and he says, the Martians, you know, they really built a nice civilization. I believe in the things that were done here, says Spender. There are streets and houses, books, canals, clocks. And then ask me if I believe in them. They're still here. We'll give the places new names, but the old names are still there. The mountains were shaped under those names, and the names we'll give will be so much like water on the back of the mallards. We'll never touch it. We'll never tame it. And this, again, is, you can start looking at, of course, some of the great American West and the way we took over some of these areas. I think he's definitely making some pretty...
There is a very, very obvious parable here.
And of course Spender goes on and says, look, we're going to rip this up, we're going to rip the skin off and
to
change it
this,
to fit ourselves.
This is 1960s New Left thinking.
Yes.
Not 1950, keep in mind, this is in the middle of the McCarthy era. This is right at the beginning. This is just the very beginning of the McCarthy era.
We won't ruin Mars, says the captain. It's too big and too good. Spender says, you think not? We Earthmen have a talent for ruining big, beautiful things. The only reason we didn't set up hot dog stands at Karnak is because it was out of the way. Yeah,
now, who's he talking about? You see, Russians don't set up hot dog stands in 1950.
It goes on. Right. And then Spender, of course, this is what we call going native in British literature, right? Where you go into Africa and you become like the natives, or you go into Malaya and become like the natives, and you begin to side with them. And Spender talks to the captain and he says, look at this. He says, we're not so hot. We're kids in rompers, but one day Earth will be as Mars is today. This will sober us. It's an object lesson in civilization. Very prophetic, like you said.
Yes.
Sounds like a 60s guru here.
Yes, see, Ray Bradbury in 1950s is sounding like a 60s radical.
That's very interesting. And he talks about, and of course there are the spooky parts about how the Martians try to cope with the Earth invasions by creating little towns that look like Ohio and Illinois and try to trap the astronauts. And
well, there were cases, of course, of when some of the first Europeans came to America that they were slaughtered, and there was resistance on the part of Native Americans to the colonization.
And that was, like you said, you mentioned it was sort of spooky, that one about where they land. This is the third expedition, and they land in this small town. It's just like an Earth town. It's been created because the Martians have read their minds ahead of time.
Yes.
This is the old Spockian
Right.
deep probes.
The only
or whatever.
defense the Martians have is telepathy against the technology of the Earthmen.
And this is good writing. Now, Bradbury says he based these little episodic pieces on Winesburg, Ohio, by
Yes.
another famous American writer, Sherwood Anderson.
Yes.
And so most of these towns look like small American towns. Green
Yes.
Bluff, Illinois. These different
There's even
towns.
a Texas in there.
And he goes on talking about, reflecting, is this heaven? One of the astronauts says, no, it's a world and we get a second chance. Nobody told us why we get a second chance, but then nobody told us why we were on Earth either. It's interesting. He's touching on some, as science fiction and Star Trek tends to do.
There's the interesting incident with the priest where they encounter the UFOs.
No, I never. Which one is this? In this?
This was in the movie.
Oh yes.
And of
Okay.
course
Tell us about that, because I
The
never.
movie, there's a case where he's a Catholic priest, and he's with a couple of other people, and they go out and they're trying to, how do we adapt Christianity as they understood it to Mars, and how do we save the Martians, this sort of thing.
Well,
And
this
they
is a
find
very
out that
American.
The Martians basically tell them through telepathy that they don't need saving, that they come down, they look like UFOs, they basically come down. The philosophy that they expound, though, is pure Gnosticism.
Which Gnosticism being
sort of that matter is evil, and that where we have they're totally incorporeal, totally spirit, and they don't eat and they don't drink and they don't have any, and to them this is a higher plane of existence.
And still, it's the chicken pox from Earth that sort of wipes out the Martians. Like I said, the War of the Worlds, which will come out in September.
Without Martians, they have to. Of course, independence, they see, because Mars is lifeless, sci-fi writers can't very well talk about Martians, although there was this spoof that came out called Mars Attacks a number of years ago. It was
Yes,
kind
I
of a
remember
spoof
that
on
one.
Independence Day and War of the Worlds. And there they had the Viking lander, and just beyond the Viking lander was the Martian city. So some people would still like to take the leap of faith and believe in Martians in spite of all the overwhelming evidence that they don't exist.
Yes, like you said, Mars has been the big fascination. I guess it's
Yes.
almost the same size. It's sort of in our neighborhood.
Well, it's the one planet in the solar system that even faintly resembles the Earth. I
Right.
mean, Venus is a roaring furnace,
Got its ice
600
caps,
degrees,
yeah.
600 degrees Fahrenheit.
And Mercury looks like it's had a bad night out.
Yes, yes. And Jupiter and the other places are basically gassed so far away.
Enormous
and
gas
they're
clouds.
gas giants.
Well, that is very interesting because Ray Bradbury, of course, is still alive, still producing, and he's into plays and all kinds of other things. And he gets up every morning saying, what's the purpose of life? It's to sort of explore things and to know things as they are. He made some great quotes on March 19th at the Performing Arts Center. Of course, we taped his show here. He says, the universe is so miraculous, it's like a big theater. And it's been created for us as the audience to celebrate and to witness it. And of course, anything to do with good science fantasy or science fiction, if we can use that phrase, does touch on big themes, cosmic themes.
Yes.
And of course, it gives us a chance to speak a little bit about
Yes.
dun dun da 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 da. So here we are. The movie has been out now for 2 or 3 weeks. And this is the second time, is it not, that Darth Vader has made the cover
Yes.
of Time magazine. So I know you're dying to tell us a little bit.
Yes.
You've even brought a book here about Star
this
Wars.
is-
So let's
this is an
swivel to
Yes, this is an interesting
Star
book.
Wars
It just
here.
came out. There's 2 that just came out. There's this one, which is more or less a couple of philosophy professors looking at Star Wars and all the different different aspects of it, the politics of Star Wars and ethics, stoicism, moral ambiguity, the aspiring, in other words, try to explore the many facets of Star Wars. There's many ways you can relate to this thing. And there's another one called The Dharma of Star Wars by a Buddhist, which looks at particularly Yoda's theology as being pure Buddhism.
Yeah.
Lucas was very much influenced by ancient mythology and Eastern religions in writing this epic.
Yeah, it's interesting that Joseph Campbell, the great scholar of mythology, of course, he and Bill Moyers filmed their series at Lucas's Skywalker Ranch, or whatever
Yes.
it's called, and up here in California. So
Yes.
here you are, you're bringing in all of these themes, and we're talking about science fiction.
Yes.
And it may seem sort of overblown, but of course the whole purpose of fiction is to allow us to see ourselves
Right.
a lot
Right,
clearer.
and a lot of science fiction is far more, a lot of science fiction has always been far more preoccupied with the Earth than with outer space.
Like a mirror.
Now, what's interesting, of course, is you look, most science fiction in the 50s was a brief history of sci-fi. Most of it in the 50s was kind of paranoid rightist. That's the only way I can describe it. You had all these monsters coming
The
down.
invasion of the body
The
snatchers.
blob,
Yeah.
you see, and
There's something out there that's
yes,
fearful.
that's evil, and
Yeah.
basically they weren't aliens; they were commies.
Right.
You see
Commies.
this? They were commies.
Commies in
Sort of the
space
communist
suits.
invasion, the communist threat. When you reach Star Trek, though, in the 1960s, you have a totally different approach to sci-fi. This is and Bradbury sort of hints at, Bradbury I think has more in common with Twilight Zone and with Star Trek than
Bradbury?
with Star Wars, yes. Because he sees things, he has essentially a liberal, I would say a fairly liberal, progressive view of the world, although not a terribly optimistic one.
Right.
Bradbury is concerned, this is the direction we might go, and Fahrenheit 451 is where everybody sits around and watches MTV and burns books, basically, and takes part in sports. And
Which again made a little bit
the
of a
dumbing down.
echo
He
effect
predicted the
because of
dumbing
Michael
down.
Moore's book.
And fire departments are basically there to burn books.
Right. I think he talked about that, about how he came up with that on the Are You the Man Who Burns Books? He was walking down the street and someone ran into him, something like that. It's but then, like you said, today with Star Wars now being released, trying to finish the series,
Yes.
again, Star Trek was optimistic.
Yes, see,
Star
Trek,
Wars ends like a train wreck, but it still has that hope at the end.
Right, right. See, Star Trek during the 60s, we're talking about the classical Star Trek.
I mean, this is the 60s, the era of optimism,
right, and
when
you have
we overdosed.
This is
on
it, and you have
optimism.
the Federation, and you have
Right.
Kirk as sort of
Kirk
like
believes you can reason with all of these
yes. There's
forces.
one scene where this Gorn, the lizard, and the thing, Kirk fights this thing in a duel, and then he's about ready to kill the thing, and of course the special effects are really tacky. The thing looks like a poor man's Tyrannosaurus Rex, and then Kirk says, "We of the Federation believe in peace and tolerance."
I do remember one episode. I wasn't, like I said, really a Star Trek fan, but I've watched the movies because I have to keep up with teenagers somehow. And I remember one of the episodes in Star Trek is where the Enterprise was being pounded by this force. Do you remember that one? And they try to reason with it logically, and then Kirk or someone figures out, well, maybe it's not an adult, maybe it's a teenager, and they have this.
Well, the thing is, a lot of the villains, like the Klingons, could be pretty nasty in the original Star Trek. They became kinder and gentler by the time of Star Trek: The Next Generation. But the Klingons in the 1960s were basically a parable for the Soviets. And,
You think they were a stand-in for the Soviets?
And the Klingons were the baddies, but generally, and even there you could sort of coexist with them to some degree. You didn't have to annihilate them, but they were nasty. But the main thing with Star Trek, most of the villains or most of the things sometimes are usually misunderstood rather than evil.
Yeah,
they were
which is the
misunderstood.
Rational 1960s.
And Kirk would negotiate with them, or he would he would respond to them in a flexible way. And The same thing carried over into the 1980s with the early 1990s. You had Next Generation with Jean-Luc Picard, and the philosophy of Star Trek was similar. The philosophy of Star Trek was similar. You still had evil, but generally, sometimes evil could be negotiated with. You had to be tough. Picard had to be tough sometimes, but the Klingons were now, in a sense, almost friends. You had Worf, who was on the deck of the Enterprise, and he was the only Klingon to serve in Star.
He made the progression. Now, speaking about evil, of course, here is the complexity of this character. Even though George Lucas is really trying to make a good versus good guys, bad guys, Darth Vader is a somewhat complex character, is he not?
Yes, very much so. I mean, the one character, if you take more or less the history of Darth Vader, biography of Darth Vader, when, and of course Lucas had sketched out this whole story, at least in outline, back in the early 70s. It's not a parable of the Bush years. Maybe Lucas had Nixon in mind.
Or the Republic's being on the mind. Yeah, that was said at the time.
Maybe it was Nixon in mind.
Since it was 77,
But we don't know. But the main thing was he wanted to make a good story of good and evil. That's what it seemed to start out as.
And of course, the interesting thing is, by planting a seed that Darth Vader is somehow, we don't find out till episode 6, right? I am your father.
Darth Vader starts out in episode 4, A New Hope, 1977, as a monster. He's just this hideous monster, you know, and then the Empire Strikes Back, he's 10 times as evil.
And the great, like I said.
And yet, at the very end, you told me enough. You told me come up. No, I am your father.
Yes, that's
and
the
leaves
big
us wondering.
Surprise.
And then at the very end, you know, in Return of the Jedi, then the whole outline of the story.
They're all back
together. It isn't Darth Vader.
Well, they're giving us the wind-up signal. We're going to have to cut you there. I'm sorry, but what a great summer reading the Martian Chronicles, and look at all the other things it led into. Keep reading, Duarte. We'll see you next time on A Second Look. Sorry to cut.